Everyone, welcome back to Pine Hollow Auto Diagnostics. Hey, guess what you got behind me? Not a day after we finished the Christmas special, people are bringing their old Chevy trucks over. 1988 K1500. Customer complaint is misfire. Mostly when it's cold, when you're in overdrive and it's kind of lugging the engine. You just feel it's getting worse. We'll see if we can make this a quick one. So going by the VIN, looks like you got the right make and model and engine size. This is the original engine. No more engine swaps. 5.7 liter V8. Engine. Got our adapter hooked up. Key on. And we'll display the codes first. Diagnostic mode, do not drive, so it actually gives you the little warning there. I don't think it did on the other one. No codes. Road test data. Alright. So we are going to customize the list. RPM, O2 integrator, open loop, closed loop, TPS, block learn, IAC, coolant. Look at the map. Also the NOx sensor. Air fuel. It also has this air diverter, like an air pump system. So I guess we can look at those guys. List view. Alright, it's fired up. Fires right up. Alright, so let's get it out on the road and take it for a spin since it happens when it's cold. So I've been driving for a while, and in 1988, I guess, they do like to go in the open loop when you're just sitting and idling in the parking lot. I'm gonna rev it up a little bit. Note that the block learn is at 149, so that's showing me this thing's running a little lean. Okay, here we go. Closed loop, 137, 138. We got block learn climbing. Integrator's at 128. And this O2 is pegged lean right now. No question about it. Why? Okay, I'll let it back off. Still lean. Block learn's maxed out for sure. Okay, now we're bouncing up and down a little bit. Let's accelerate here and see how she accelerates. So far pretty smooth. Should be in overdrive. There's no tack on this thing, it's just the speedometer. So far the O2 looks pretty decent. It clears kind of bad today from the sunshine, but keep driving it and see if we notice anything out of the ordinary. Alright, so the truck did act up a couple times for like a second, and one of those times I was looking down at my scanner, I noticed the RPMs were like at 6,000 RPM. You can see it right there, that little spike. That's when the problem occurred. So we're going to save this data, because so far that's the only evidence we have of what the problem is. So we can stop the recording. Oh no, not clear the data. We'll just pause it and see what happened right there. So I wonder if we zoom out if we have any other spikes. We had one spike right there too. And look at our knock. Your knock is climbing to 149. But what the heck goes on when we see these abnormal spikes in the RPM? And that's when the truck kind of stumbled and surged and then went back to normal. It was definitely in when we were just cruising. You can see the RPMs are about 1800, under 2000. Then it spiked up to 6,300 and it came right back down. That's when the problem occurred. So that's our clue. It happened once more right here. Right there. Let's see. Zoom in. Again, false data, but we need to put a scope on the wire that goes from the pickup coil in the distributor to the computer and see exactly what signal we're getting. It'll take a little bit of time because it only acted up like maybe twice in 10 miles. So we have to look up exactly which wire to hook up to, make sure all our settings are good, and we're ready for this when it happens. And then, you know, hopefully it shouldn't be a big deal to repair this truck if we see the signals messed up. You know, it could be a little problem in the pickup coil inside the distributor, but I think we'll get there. All right, so what's the next step with the Chevy truck? Let's make a game plan, just like we did with the other one, and figure out this problem. So what do we have to go by so far? We took the truck for a test drive. It acted up twice, both times for a couple of seconds, and then it drove fine afterwards. On the scan data, our only clue to, you know, when the problem occurred, let's see if we can minimize the glare here. I guess it's coming from the ceiling light. Was right here when the RPM spiked to something unreasonable. Zoom in. This point right here, 6,375. So that's what we're worried about. This is when the truck kind of really surged, lost power, stumbled, whatever you want to call it. It felt like a full engine shutdown. It wasn't like a single cylinder misfire or something. This was pretty drastic. If you look at all the rest of the data, nothing really seems crazy. None of the other PIDs, you know, we can customize this list. Let's look at RPM and let's say coolant temp, open loop, closed loop, IAC, map, TPS, and O2. So let's put our cursor right on that spot where the RPMs spiked up artificially. truck lost power. All the other data PIDs look pretty normal. Nothing dropped out. So in the second instance when this happened was right here. Zoom in on that. Again, just for one data point. And I remember driving it, it happened, I looked down in the scanner, I'm like, why are my RPMs at 6,375? All the other data PIDs look fine. So, in this case, you know, how does the system work? What would cause the truck to basically not stall out, but completely lose its key running components, ignition and injection? That's what it felt like. Well, the only sensor, the only input to this PCM of the engine speed, of the RPM, is coming from the distributor, more specifically the ignition control module. So back to this familiar bypass ignition system. There's a pickup coil. This is our ignition control module, and it's tied to the PCM with 4 wires. And we covered this in the other video too, what the 4 wires do. The reference here, that's the signal from the ignition control module to the PCM of the current RPM. It's like the crank signal or cam signal. There's only one rotation sensor on this engine. So that wire right there, that's the only input to the PCM of the engine speed. Now the other 3 wires, the EST is the actual ignition control, so the computer figures out how far do we want to advance this timing and then sends the pulse back to the ignition control module to make the spark on the ignition coil. The bypass wire, that's just high or low. When the engine is above 400 RPM, the computer says, hey, now I want to be in control, so it powers up that wire. So the ignition control module gives control to the PCM of that spark timing. And if you disconnect that, then ignition timing will just be controlled by the module. That'll be the base timing. That's how you set the ignition timing initially when you're setting up the distributor. Finally, reference low, that's just a ground wire. And that's it. So with the picoscope, I want to do 4 channels and drive this thing until it acts up. The 4 channels will be, 1 is that RPM reference signal going into the PCM. 2 is the spark output. 3 will be an injector control wire. It's ground side switched. And 4 is this ground wire between the ICM and the PCM. Want to make sure that stays, you know, we have a good ground all the time. So this test will tell us, is this an input problem? If we don't get a good RPM signal, the computer won't know when to fire the injectors or the ignition coil. Or if our input stays good and the PCM is crapping out, then we'll suspect something wrong with the engine computer. So not too many variables in this one, although it might seem like a weird symptom, you know, anything could cause it. But just by the symptoms here, we're looking at an input problem or an output problem from the computer. That's why we're doing 4 channels. So on this test drive, I'm hoping we can get right to the root cause of the problem. Alright, just for reference, here's the setup of the scope. I got the ground lead connected securely to the battery here because that is, I've learned from experience, that's the only reliable ground, is right on the battery. No variables. We don't want to introduce any variables for our scope if we don't have to. So there's the ground lead. Here are the 4 channels. Channel 1, blue, purple, and white. That's the reference RPM input signal to the PCM. Number 2 is the ESC. That's the spark control. Red channel, white wire right there. 3, injector driver. That blue wire, pin D16, and 4 is that ground, black and red. That'll be our yellow channel right here. So picoscope's hooked up. I'm going to fire up the laptop, take this thing for a spin. Hopefully it acts up. All right, here we go. Let's check our scope. Start the truck up. Looks like we have good signals. And we can always stop, zoom in and verify. So these guys are 0 to 4 volt, 0 to 5 volt, input and output. And these are, or the green ones are, injector control wire. Let's put this voltage on plus or minus 100 volts. Pause it. Come on. So this is a peak and hold system. So it opens the injector, then holds it, and then lets it go. So this is a known good, I think. But we're mostly interested in the input and output signals here. So in this case, for the test drive, we do want a long time base for our screen, and whenever it acts up, we can easily zoom in and see, hey, we definitely had a glitch in, you know, our input or our output. All right. So let's take this thing for a spin. Well, I drove it for 10 miles. It runs perfect. Absolutely no hiccups, power loss, or anything. I've been looking at the scanner. The RPMs have not spiked up. I took the same route, did the same RPMs, the same routine as yesterday. No luck. Well, we didn't change anything yet. What are the potential variables here? The only thing we touched was the actual computer, and we just kind of moved it from its home over here to over here. So could there potentially be some wiring problems here? Maybe one of these wires is chafing on something, and then when we moved it slightly, it's not, you know, touching whatever, grounding out. So we're gonna have to do a careful visual inspection of that wiring harness from the computer to the engine, because, you know, we didn't really do anything yet, but the problem seems to have gone away. I'm gonna drive it for a while longer, but it'd be nice to see this thing act up. Just taking a quick look at the data we captured on the Pico. I mean, this is known good. You can see the ground voltage doesn't go much above 100 millivolts. That's good. This is actually between the ignition control module and the computer on this reference wire. Channel 4 right here, reference low. But it's interesting to see, you can actually see the voltage rise as the ignition coil gets charged up, and that is exactly synchronized with our EST pulse going from the computer to the ICM. That's pretty neat to see. So on the rising edge, the coil is turned on, there's a dwell time, and then right there the spark happens on the falling edge. That's how the computer controls the spark timing. The injector control is also pretty neat. So this is just injector number 1, and you can see it fires every second spark event. And the really neat thing is this pulse width. So basically the pulse width is, you know, from when it gets turned on to right here where it gets turned up. You can actually see the little pintle hump there. And the delta is like 3 milliseconds. Now this is at idle at low RPM. And on this screen, this is where I did the full throttle acceleration. So right here is where the RPMs really increased. It was under heavy load. And check out what the injectors are doing right here. So it gets turned on and gets held open pretty much the entire time, the entire 2 spark events, and then it's basically open all the time. You know, it closes and it instantly opens back up. So it's being held open under full throttle, full acceleration, maximum fuel flow right here. Again, engine runs perfect, no stumbles, no anything. But it's good to have something like this in your database as a known good. So now the question is, can we find the problem if we couldn't recreate it? I'm going to get a flashlight, go right to that computer wiring harness, and see if there's anything out of the ordinary. So the Chevy truck, it's been here for 2 weeks. I've put over 200 miles on it, and it has not hiccuped since that very first test drive when the owner was here. I really can't believe it, but what do you do in this situation? So, you know, I told the owner, hey, if you pay me for gas, I'll just keep using the truck, run my own errands. I don't want to put more diagnostic time into it per se. But if it's not inconvenient, I'll just keep driving it. If it acts up, I'll have the scanner hooked up, logging data. But it has not hiccuped. The RPM spike has not reoccurred. And we didn't really touch anything. The only thing that we touched was the computer when we were hooking up our scope leads to it. So was that, was there like a poor connection behind the glove box and we just fiddled with it and it restored itself? I looked at the wiring harness, no wiring damage or anything at all. The truck runs beautiful. So, if the owner lived close by, I wouldn't hesitate to give it back to him and say, hey, drive it. If it doesn't act up for a month, we'll call it fixed. But he's 2 hours away, so I just kind of feel, I don't want to just give it back to him and then it acts up, then he has to bring it back. It's just a lot of hassle for the customer. We want to avoid that at all costs. So in this case, the last thing I want to do is an ignition timing check, just because, and then we'll wrap this one up. So for ignition timing, you want to start this up. It's already warmed up. Our timing light is connected to cylinder number 1. When it flashes, you see down there, the owner actually marked the see that yellow mark? So that's at idle. However, for base timing, we want to disconnect the ESP connector right here, just like we did on the other truck. RPMs drop. And now, see that yellow mark right there? See it. I don't know if the camera refresh rate's picking it up, but it's right there. And it's spot on, it's 0 degrees, right at TDC. So there's nothing wrong with this ignition timing. Truck runs beautiful. Sometimes you just have to know when to stop and say, hey man, drive the truck. It runs great. If it starts acting up, if the problem's still there, we'll deal with it, when time comes. But it's reliable, and if it acts up for like a second once a month, that's not a big deal. I'm not worried about it. So just to wrap up, This is the first test drive that I did when the owner was still here, and we noticed, now this is for sure, is that when the truck surged, now it only happened for a second, 2 times it happened in 10 miles, the RPMs spiked to 6,375 RPM. So, and none of the other data was affected. We can scroll through all the data PIDs and nothing jumps out. Nothing's skewed. O2, integrator, block learn, IAC, the knock sensor, the TPS, nothing wrong with that. The only thing that jumped out was the actual RPM. Now in this case, if we had the scope hooked up, maybe we would have seen, an input problem coming from the ignition control module or the pickup coil or something, but once I hooked that scope up, this problem just vanished. It has not come back in the last 200 miles. Every test drive I did, the scanner was hooked up, logging the same data, no spikes, truck drove just perfect. So unfortunately, we're gonna have to leave it at that. If anyone has ever experienced a similar symptom, leave it down in the comments. The owner's gonna pick up the truck in a week or so when it's convenient, but I told him unless anyone else has any ideas, if you can't reproduce the problem, you can't find the problem or fix the problem. You kind of have a clue of where it might come from, but you're just going to be chasing your tail. So in this case, I'm like, just drive it. If it gets worse, if it happens on every test drive, yes, we have a chance. If it happens once a month or once a year, not even worth chasing your tail. So leave your comments down below. Let me know what you think, and hopefully you enjoyed the case study. All right, see you guys next time. Bye-bye. So while we're here, I couldn't help myself. I took a zoomed in, high detailed capture of a snap throttle, and I put a current clamp on that injector control wire just to look at the voltage, control voltage, and the current, and see how the two relate. Drive home this peak and hold system operation. So the yellow trace is the injector current, and 1 volt is 10 amps. So 0.3 volts is going to be, they peak around 4 amps. And here we can see different events. So this is at idle. Zoom in here. So the injector's turned on. See, the current ramps up, and then the current is held at 1 amp. 100 millivolts is 1 amp. And look at the voltage on the control wire. Look what it's doing. It's actually, if this is ground and this is battery voltage, this is pretty neat the way it's holding that current by pulsing the ground. So just to demonstrate this, that's 0 volts. That's 0 volts right there. That's 14 volts. But right here it's toggling between about 6 volts and 20. So this is like a really fast switch, but look at the current. The current's staying at 1 amp. That's pretty amazing. The electronic controls here to hold that injector open. And then the voltage right here, it drops off. So the diode actually clips it at 50 volts, and then it drops back down to battery voltage. And the current right here also drops down, and the injector closes off. But mechanically, I think it's closing right here. You can kind of see a pintle hump on the voltage trace. So these injectors are quite, not as simple as it might seem. They're actually more intricate control than your average port injector. Let's see what happens when we snap that throttle. This hold time gets drastically increased. I mean, stretched out. And in milliseconds, let's see, this one is being held open about 6 milliseconds. And you can see those hold times. The strategy here isn't as trivial as it might seem. Sometimes it holds it open for a while, then it kind of holds it open for a little bit, and then another long hold time, then a bigger gap. But the strategy here is pretty neat. And we want to make sure that our input stays very consistent. So the RPMs are just increasing. So the computer is being very smart about this injector strategy and also the ignition timing. So that's about it.